Welcome, everyone. So my name is Ben Sachs. I am the Jewish scholar and the head of scholarship here at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. A number of you have been doing things with us for years, and so welcome back. And there are a few of you who are new to the Institute. So what I will say to you now, I won't take up most of your time. We are an organization that aspires to dismantle religious bias and bigotry by building learning communities where religious difference, our real religious difference, becomes a powerful force for good. And to learn more about who we are and what we do and how you can join in this work, you can visit our website and learn about the multiple ways and opportunities that we can do this work together. It is an incredible honor to welcome you all and to welcome our guest at the ICJS today, Dr. Victoria Barnett, for our program, Unpacking Bonhoeffer's Legacy Today. I should say before I introduce Vicky that Vicky has had a really important relationship with our institute, and in particular myself and our executive director, Heather Miller-Rubins. I think Vicky knows this, but it bears repeating. Her influence, at least for both of us in considering this work, is vast. I hadn't even thought about doing interreligious work until I did her seminars at the Holocaust Museum when I was a professor way back when. And it was her influence that in many ways changed my career trajectory. So it's an honor for me and for Heather, who has been working with Vicky since she got to the Institute in 2011. It's also important to note that for those who have been with the ICJS, Peggy succeeded, or Peggy, see, you can see where I'm going with this. Vicky succeeded Peggy Obrecht at the Holocaust Museum and has enjoyed a meaningful friendship with the Obrechts over the years. And so you can see how this is a natural program for all of us. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Barnett, and then we're going to have a conversation about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Or I'm going to ask her questions. You don't want to know. I have nothing to offer. I just only want to ask the questions. Victoria Barnett is one of the world's preeminent scholars of the history of the Protestant churches during the Holocaust. She was one of the general editors of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works in the English edition and is a leading expert on the German Protestant theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. She's the author of Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust, For the Soul of the People, Protestant Protest Against Hitler, After 10 Years, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Our Times. She is also the editor and translator of Wolfgang Gerlach's And the Witnesses Were Silent, The Confessing Church and the Jews, the new revised editions of Eberhard Bechte's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Biography, and Christiana Tate's Karl Barth, A Life in Conflict. Dr. Barnett served as the Director of Programs on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum from 2004 to 2019. From 2023 to 2024, she was the Frank Talbot Jr. Endowed Visiting Professor in Jewish Studies at the University of Virginia. So again, it is our honor to welcome Dr. Barnett to the ICJS. And so to get started, because this might be possible in our group, who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and why does he have such a robust following in the American Christian public?
Well, thank you, Ben. And it really is a joy to be part of an ICGS program. As Ben noted, I've worked with people at ICGS for a long time and have many longtime friendships with them. And I have a great deal of admiration for the work of ICGS. So it really is a pleasure to do this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian, pastor, who became very active between the years 1933 and 1945 during the Nazi era. primarily in the fight against the Nazification of his church. He was just beginning his career when Hitler came to power. He turned 26 several days after Hitler achieved or rose to the chancellorship, and immediately became engaged in the battles within the German Protestant church about how to respond to National Socialism and how to respond to the attempts to Nazify the church. He was anti-Nazi from the beginning. One of the very first things he wrote a week after Hitler came to power was a critique of the so-called Führer principle, in which he warned against authoritarian leaders. He was involved in the Protestant ecumenical movement in Europe. He had studied at Union Theological Seminary in New York in the early 1930s, so he knew people in this country. Over the 1930s, he became involved both in ecumenism and in the fight for the so-called confessing church, which was the movement in Protestant that arose to combat the pro-Nazis within Protestantism. He also had ties to the German resistance movement that attempted to overthrow the regime during the wartime years, which was primarily orchestrated by his brother-in-law, a man named Hans von Dohnanyi, who was married to Bonhoeffer's sister. One thing I always like to mention is that the entire Bonhoeffer family was very involved in the issues confronting Germans under National Socialism. And 4 members of the immediate family were executed in April of 1945. It wasn't just Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but his brother Klaus was also executed, and 2 of his brothers-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi and Rüdiger Schleicher, were also executed. He became immediately known, and this is one of the fascinating things about his story, because he was a very young man. When he was executed, he was only 39 years of age. He wasn't a leader of the German church. He wasn't a bishop. He wasn't well established as a theologian. But I think through his international ties, his activities during the 1930s, his links to the resistance, when word of his execution was made known, and that happened very quickly after the defeat of Nazi Germany, he was sort of seized upon as the Christian hero who fought the Nazis. And this happened so quickly that it's rather astonishing. Reinhold Niebuhr in this country wrote a little eulogy to him called Death of a Martyr, which was published in June of 1945. Bishop George Bell in London preached a sermon at a memorial service for Bonhoeffer in July of 1945 that was broadcast by the BBC. So he was immediately kind of the person that people knew about. And that, I think, helps explain much of the legend and perhaps quite a bit of the historical distortion, because he was seen from the very beginning, he was seen as a symbolic figure. He had also published a number of works that are now considered theological classics. And by the early 1950s, these works were available in English. His book on discipleship, his little book on life together, a story of Christian community, and then his prison letters, which were published in the 1950s. So by the mid-1950s, if Americans knew, or in the English-speaking world, if people knew a name, it was the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So that's briefly who he was and why we're still talking about him.
Well, and it sounds like that we've been talking about him for a very long time. In his biography of him, Eberhard Wechter writes when he came to the U.S. in 1958 that everyone in the U.S. had their own Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
That there was something about Bonhoeffer that was a mirror to people's sensibilities that made him very appealing. And so what did he mean by that in a deeper sense? And is it possible that some of these people who admired Bonhoeffer turned him into something that he wasn't?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So first of all, Eberhard Bethge was a student of Bonhoeffer's. He was a young man studying theology in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. He was in a church that was led by somebody who was pro-Nazi, who told him at some point that if he wanted a career, he needed to go somewhere else. Eberhard Bethge ended up going to Bonhoeffer's seminary in the mid-1930s. That's where they met. They soon became very good friends. Beke eventually married one of Bonhoeffer's nieces, the daughter of Rüdiger Schleicher. And in the aftermath of the defeat of Nazi Germany and the disaster that had befallen this family, Beke was the one who really kind of held the family together and put the pieces back together. So it's interesting that his early post-war focus wasn't just about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it was about bigger things. But he was soon called upon to write things, to talk about who this person was. And so Beke was instrumental, I would say, in shaping the story from the very beginning. And in the 1950s, he got a fellowship at Harvard to come and begin to work on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's biography. Beke was the literary executor of Bonhoeffer's estate, so he had the Bonhoeffer Works volumes, which are built upon that estate, are 17 volumes. So there's a lot there to go through. And Beke, in crafting the story, I think, did several things. His book, which is about 1,000 pages, it's a huge biography, and it's still viewed as the definitive one. He wanted to talk about the world from which Bonhoeffer came. He wanted to talk about the family, talk about Bonhoeffer's theological upbringing, and then he gets into the Nazi years. And his focus there is really the church struggle. It's what happens within German Protestantism, and then he gets into the resistance years. But when he came to the United States, as Ben just mentioned, he was rather astonished that everybody already had a certain understanding of Bonhoeffer, and that understanding was based on this early heroic narrative. Bonhoeffer was the Christian who fought the Nazis. And there wasn't, people didn't necessarily know anything about the resistance or about the German church struggle. And so, and this is also the era in which the first books about the German church struggle were very hagiographic. I mean, the German Protestant church portrayed itself, as did the Catholic Church in the early post-war years, as having valiantly fought against the Nazis. We now know that's not true. It took several decades for that historiography to emerge, and for the larger historiography about the persecution of the Jews, about the realities in Nazi Germany, about the complicity of so many institutions. This was a process that took decades, during which the Bonhoeffer narrative stayed frozen. I mean, Bonhoeffer was the hero. So there's an interesting dynamic, and I don't think Beke was responsible for this, but an interesting dynamic in which Bonhoeffer is somehow, as the British historian Andrew Chandler has said, he's stuck in the historical grooves of the 1950s. And in the meantime, we know a whole lot more about the complexity of all these people, but somehow the literature and the films on Bonhoeffer have bypassed that. He's still a symbol. And as you just said, Ben, when people understand somebody as symbolic of, the fight against the Nazis, you leave out lots of complexity, and you invariably, I think, skew the picture. And that's one of the things I think that has really happened to the Bonhoeffer literature, even though we now have all this other literature about Nazi Germany, and we have, his collected works. So if people really get into him, I think there's a different person to be found.
Well, yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read back to you something that you wrote, because in a recent essay for Christian Century titled "There's No Such Thing as a Bonhoeffer Moment," you write that, quote, most American versions of Bonhoeffer, particularly in popular books and films, draw on a hero image. And you will argue that Bonhoeffer shouldn't be seen you argue that Bonhoeffer should be seen from a much larger perspective, not as a heroic figure at the forefront, but one among many. And you emphasize that in your writing. What do you mean by that? One among many heroes, or one among many potential Bonhoeffers?
One among many very complicated people.
Okay.
So I'm not really a Bonhoeffer person, believe it or not. I came to all of this having written a book on the Confessing Church. I did my research in Germany during the 1980s. I interviewed over 60 people who had been in the Confessing Church. And so I was deliberately not writing about Bonhoeffer. I wanted to write about this movement of which he was a part. And as I did that, I gained an incredibly complicated picture of the confessing church, which at the time I wrote the book was still, I think, largely understood as kind of a resistance movement. It wasn't. This was a church of people. They never left the German Protestant church. They remained part of this larger institution. So they were doing battle with the leadership of their church from within. And it was a very mixed bag. There were members of the confessing church who were Nazi Party members. There were members who fully were on board with much of what the Nazis did, but they didn't like what was happening in the church. So you've got this wide range of people. You also have people who rescued Jews. You have people who were very anti-Nazi. And Bonhoeffer is part of this much larger picture. And as I got into this material, and I've continued to this day to do this kind of research, if you look at Bonhoeffer not as the only guy, but as one of this much larger movement, you begin to find connections he had to other people that we didn't know about. If you only view Bonhoeffer from the top down, you see, and this is what Baker's biography and most of the biographies do. They're looking at Bonhoeffer meeting with the ecumenical movement, Bonhoeffer studying with Niebuhr, Bonhoeffer. He's the main figure. This is what happens when you write a biography, right? When you look at the confessing church as a whole, you see that some people didn't even know who he was until after 1945. He was a young man. Other people knew him in certain contexts, but didn't understand where he ended up. There were people that Bethke himself didn't meet Bonhoeffer until 1935. There are other people that Bethke didn't even know about or didn't really talk about who knew him well during the 1920s and have very different insights into him from that period. So there's a complexity there that I think you only get if you look at Bonhoeffer from below, really day by day, over the course of these 12 years of National Socialism, during which he fights some battles and he loses, where he's exploring his own options and where he's wrestling with his own conscience. And for me, that's the fascinating thing about working on the Bonhoeffer works, is that you have this day-by-day record of a decent human being trying to do the right thing in a totalitarian state, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding. The only other document from the Nazi years that I think is comparable are the diaries of Victor Klemperer, which is also, Klemperer was a German Jew, a historian, who began to keep a diary day by day throughout the 1930s. So you see how this looks as it unfolds. Klemperer has no idea where this is going. And in a similar fashion, that's what Bonhoeffer is doing in his letters from the very beginning. I mean, when you edit the Bonhoeffer works, you're looking at volume by volume, year by year, and seeing what he knows, what he doesn't know, the mistakes he makes. One of the most fascinating things I found in an archive last year in Berlin, I was looking in the papers of Friedrich Sigmund Schulze, who's another one of these people should know more about. Sigmund Schulze was a pacifist, very powerful anti-Nazi, set up a social welfare center in the 1920s where he worked together with Jews, Christians, communists, journalists. So he was already a social activist when the Nazis come to power. And he's one of the few Protestants who has close relationships to the Jewish community. So in 1933, Hitler comes to power. Sigmund Schulze reaches out to Leo Baeck, the rabbi in Berlin, and says, what can we do? And they begin to work together to help German Jews, with the result that Sigmund Schulze is arrested in July of 1933 and expelled to Switzerland. Sigmund Schulze is an old friend of the Bonhoeffer family. And so he has these fascinating insights into Bonhoeffer during the 1920s. But he also says with regard to 1933, that Bonhoeffer, his comment on Bonhoeffer during 1933 was that he was very naive, that he was in over his head. He didn't know where he was going. And look, he's 26. There's a totalitarian state. All hell is breaking loose in the Protestant church. And, Bonhoeffer is navigating this. Bonhoeffer, when he goes to Switzerland in 1941 on behalf of the German resistance, seeks out Sigmund Schulze and apologizes to him and says, I was listening to the wrong people in 1933. You don't get that when you have the heroic picture. The fact that this young man who was trying to do the right thing seeks Sigmund Schulze out later and says, I made mistakes. I didn't I listened to the wrong people. And so I think that complexity is what we need to get into the Bonhoeffer story.
So, I mean, it sounds like when people say there's a Bonhoeffer moment,
Yeah.
they have an idea of a singular understanding of resistance,
Yeah.
fortified by important grounding in faith in what's right and wrong, and doing it regardless of your own self-interest. I'm wondering if his complexity and at times humility comes to the foreground of how we discuss him, what a Bonhoeffer moment could look like if it took into account all of those things, and that there are potentially, when we say a Bonhoeffer moment, it's also the people that are invisible that are doing this work as well. That if we're going to reimagine his name in terms of a certain type of resistance, because it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like in what I've read of what you were writing about is that our connections to Bonhoeffer represent a certain proclivity in our religious imagination to elevate men to a status that we can, and I'm very clear in saying men, because there is a certain patriarchal orientation to a charismatic figure. That maybe if people are doing that, that we can use the name to include those that we don't elevate, who are doing just as important work and with the same humility, who fall through the cracks.
That's an interesting insight. Yeah, as I sometimes tell people, Bonhoeffer in 1945 was what people thought a hero looked like. He was a man. He was a minister. He had been executed by the Nazis. He was internationally known. I mean, it was sort of this composite where you can see how it happened that he so quickly rose to this kind of symbolism. I would actually like to do away with Bonhoeffer moments
Okay.
because I think there's no way, if you've got a Bonhoeffer moment, it's still Bonhoeffer-centric. I would love a Sigmund Schulze moment. Or, I mean, the thing is that
Until we run into the same problem.
well, and the thing is that historically, when you look at the complexity of this issue or the complexity of any dissident in a system that is trying to push back against the tide, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
I mean, the Bonhoeffer moment questions, I started getting those in the 90s when I was first giving talks on him. The other question I often got was, what do you think Bonhoeffer would do today? And first,
Get lost in his iPhone?
we don't know. And secondly, why are we asking that question? Isn't there a different entry into his life and work that gets us thinking about deeper things? And that's where, when you read him, that's where he takes you. I mean, he himself was a very thoughtful, self-critical individual. And one of the moving things about reading him over the decades over the years from 1933 to 1945 is that he tracks the failure of Christian culture, of the churches, of German, politics and the German country. He was raised in a family that revered sort of the great philosophers and artists and writers of German culture. And, by the early 1940s, after 10 years of National Socialism, he looks at the entire ethical, moral, and cultural structure on which his world had been created and has to acknowledge that it had failed, that it had ended in the barbarism of the Nazi regime, and that so many people had compromised. And that's actually what his little essay called After 10 Years is about. That's why it's called After 10 Years. He's looking back at 10 years of National Socialism and exploring what has happened to all the good people that he's surrounded with, including himself. And so I think to understand Bonhoeffer, we also have to understand his honesty in recognizing that failure and in using that. And this is where I think his prison writings come in. Once he's in prison after 1943, he begins to ponder, what can possibly come out of all this, both in terms of Christianity, in terms of Germany. And that stuff is very powerful. So in Bonhoeffer, as I said, you have something similar with Victor Klemperer. He's reflecting on what is happening to his country. Bonhoeffer is doing the same thing. And so seeing him as a chronicle, somebody who's writing a chronicle of what is happening in a totalitarian state to people of conscience, that's where I think he has a lot of value, and especially to speak to us today.
So, and it sounds like people need to be reading him and people need to be thinking about him. And I'm also wondering, we'll say, about the medium of film.
Yeah.
And as you know, and I wrote down the title just to make sure I didn't get it incorrect,
Right.
because I haven't seen the film,
Okay.
but Angel Studios released it, and it's called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Spy, Assassin. I read reviews of it, and they're mixed. And so I'm curious if you've seen the film, what you think about, and what you think about it, and if it's doing the kind of work that you're describing.
Yeah. So the short answer to the last question is no.
Okay.
I'm a terrible person to watch a Bonhoeffer movie with because I don't like any of them. And the thing is that the movies, I think Bonhoeffer still has this very heroic image in popular culture. So if somebody's going to make a movie about him, that's what the movie's about. That sort of Lone Ranger, the Christian hero fighting the Nazis. As I said, historically, that's a fiction, and theologically, it really misses who he was. And so when you have that in a film, the films, this is a well-made film, it's engaging, great actors, it sort of carries viewers along. But it's make-believe, it's a fantasy. And in this film in particular, there are so many historical mistakes that as a historian, I kept thinking, wait, what did they just do? But like I said, I'm a bad person to watch a movie like that with. As you may know, when the movie was in the works before it came out, there was alarm about the advertising and marketing around this film. And so a group of international Bonhoeffer scholars, we watched it together before the film came out and issued a statement warning that this kind of narrative is easily hijacked by Christian nationalists. Bonhoeffer has a following among Christian nationalists who kind of seize this Christian hero narrative and turn it into their own cause. It's not just Christian nationalists who do that; other people do it too. But we were very alarmed, given the political divisions in this country, that this could be dangerous. And so we issued a statement that is now on the web and that people have signed. But independently of that, I mean, just in terms of watching the film, the problems are what I just described.
So if I could just focus on the Christian nationalist part
Yeah.
just for a moment, it would seem that resistance against nationalism is an essential part of fighting totalitarian and authoritarian states.
Right.
That nationalism in it of itself,
Yeah.
the problem that creates the conditions for that kind of resistance. And so I'm wondering how Christian nationalists, both self-described and then those that we describe, we as a broad we,
Yeah.
as Christian nationalists, how they see Bonhoeffer fitting into any type of nationalist
Yeah.
view.
It's a wonderful question, and it's really an interesting dynamic with this film because there are scholars and other people who have seen this film and love it. I mean, people whom I otherwise, have respect for. So they see this as a film of Bonhoeffer fighting the Nazis. What's wrong with that? There is, but you have leading Christian nationalists who have embraced Bonhoeffer, and so I think I think maybe the part of that narrative, and this is why the symbolic Christian hero image is so problematic, is that it's sort of a non-complex form of Christian moral absolutism. Bonhoeffer is a very Christian writer. So if you read his theological writings, especially his book on discipleship, this is, as he writes in that book, when Christ calls a man, he calls him to come and die. So this is, part of that narrative. And so for a very, evangelical Christian, some of his other biblical writings really resonate. And what they do is they take the political narrative and kind of fold it into his theology to create a very absolutist understanding of Christianity. There's a reference to Bonhoeffer in the Project 2025 document, which is talking about restoring the United States Christian values. And so the complexity that exists in Bonhoeffer, and I would say his own transition to understanding the dangers of a certain kind of Christianity, that's a process you can trace in him. The other thing I would say, and this is a problem in Bonhoeffer scholarship across the board, I would say, is that we have a natural tendency to try to create a seamless garment with somebody like this. We take his writings, we take his opposition to the Nazis, we take all the factors we know about him, and we try to sort of develop this into a coherent theological narrative. And one of the things I think that is striking about Bonhoeffer is that he has political opinions that he does not try to back up with his theology. In other words, there are places where he's not consistent. One of the big debates among scholars for years has been, if he's a pacifist and he has strongly pacifist writings, how does he end up in a plot that's going to overthrow the Nazi regime by violence? Shouldn't he have found a different way? And when I was writing my book, I interviewed Eberhard Bethge, the first interview I did with him back in the 1980s, and I asked him that question. I said, so how did Bonhoeffer theologically justify his involvement in this resistance movement? And Bethge looked at me and he said, he didn't. He said he understood the dangers of that. He said he really, he didn't try to justify it theologically. What he did was say, this is what I believe is necessary. These are my political views. I am willing to answer before God for what I do. And so, Bonhoeffer's writings on ethics and taking responsibility is the way of reading that, but there's not a coherent theological narrative that explains everything he does.
And so, I mean, this is an obvious question because those who know me know that it's going to not be unsurprising since I work in German Jewish history.
Right.
I think it's impossible to imagine any German Christian's theological point of view without considering their views of Jews and Judaism. And and rescuers had a complicated relationship with Jews that they were rescuing, and in some cases they were conditional. There were in some cases it was with the hope of conversion.
Yeah.
And when you're being rescued, and the action itself is it merits a great deal of respect and gratitude. But given the history of Christian anti-Judaism, and given that it informs so many elements of German Jewish life, from Kristallnacht, with Martin Sassa celebrating Luther's birthday by literally burning synagogues and stores and saying Luther's prophecy is coming true, that this is a day to celebrate. It's hard to imagine any German Christian context, whether in resisting the Nazis or in supporting them, without some interpretation of how Jews play a role in Christian theology. And so the long preamble to that, with this long preamble, I'm curious what Bonhoeffer's relationship to Jews and Judaism was. And you sent me a paragraph describing it. But before we get to that paragraph, maybe you could talk about what it was. What did he think about us?
So as he said, we could do a whole webinar on this. But I'll try to be brief. So there are theological issues, as you know, and there's not much in Bonhoeffer's theology on this issue. He doesn't seem to have been involved in the Christian-Jewish exchanges of the 1920s. He didn't address Judaism extensively. It wasn't something he really studied. And, you know, I mentioned to you this new volume on documentary history of Jewish-Christian relations that Cambridge University Press just brought out. I wrote the chapter on the early 20th century in Germany. And there was an active, there were conversations going on. There were things happening, especially in Berlin. So Bonhoeffer would have had an opportunity had he been interested. That wasn't where he was coming from. So there's not much theologically to sort of hold on to here. His main engagement on this issue came in 1933 when the controversy about the so-called Arian paragraph arose within the Protestant church. And for some of your viewers who have studied this, let me just sort of say at the beginning, because this is something people often get confused about. The Nazi state never took over the German Protestant church. The Nazi state did not try to impose its state Arian paragraph on the church in 1933. That happened because you had this pro-Nazi faction within German Protestantism called the German Christian Faith Movement. They wanted to do that. And so Hitler, when the Arian paragraph was passed, the civil service Arian paragraph was passed in 1933, left implementation of that up to different institutions. The German Christians were the faction within the German Protestant church who said, okay, let's exclude all so-called non-Arians from the church, and we'll Nazify the church. And that's what launched the so-called German church struggle. That's what led to the development of the confessing church. So it was an internal church debate about whether to conform church law to state law. Who are we talking about here? We're talking about 350,000 some Christians of Jewish descent who at some point had been baptized or came from Christian families who were in the church. And suddenly there's this movement afoot to kick them out. They were never expelled from the church. This is another fiction that is often put out there. So all of a sudden you've got this controversy, and that's where Bonhoeffer weighs in and writes an essay in 1933 called The Church and the Jewish Question, where he's saying, okay, what should we do here? Bonhoeffer is one of probably around 20 people in 1933 who write about this issue. And when you look at all those statements together, it's fascinating because they all approach it differently. I mean, he doesn't approach it theologically. The document that does that is written by somebody named Hans Ehrenberg. So Bonhoeffer is addressing this specifically as a church-state issue and how the church should conform in a society like this. And so, his first point is, the church has its own territory, the state has its own territory. They determine what happens. He says, but what happens when the state authority is no longer legitimate, and how does the church know that? And he then makes the fascinating argument that when a state strips a minority population of its rights, that's when it no longer becomes legitimate. And that's when the essay turns, and Bonhoeffer then begins to talk about what the church has to do when a state is no longer legitimate. And that's the famous spoke in the wheel quote, where Bonhoeffer says, well, first, the church has to speak out. Secondly, the church has to help the victims of this, whether they're Christian or not. And thirdly, the church may have to put the spoke in the wheel to stop the mechanism of the state from turning. So it's a very complicated essay. And in the middle of this essay is this extraordinarily anti-Semitic paragraph. And if you want to show that briefly.
Sure.
This is the paragraph that has caused all the controversy about what Bonhoeffer thought about the Jews. So you can read it while I'm talking. This is, if you want a one paragraph summary of Christian anti-Judaism, this is it. These are the old tropes. And it's rather shocking in the middle of this larger essay. It's also shocking, and this is something we realized only about 20 years ago. This paragraph is not in any of his original drafts. So he's writing something between the time that he sends it to the magazine and the time that they publish it. This paragraph pops in. It pops into the published edition, but not before then. And so the question is, what happened? Did somebody else write this? Did somebody say to Bonhoeffer, you need something theological in there? and we can't, I have dug in archives as deeply as I think anybody can. We may never know the answer to that. He never said he didn't write it. He did tell somebody later that he regretted that it was in there. But the question is there a background suggestion about this that he puts it in? But the heart of his essay is really this argument that is based on civil liberties. And I would argue that, his take on that, it's not theological, it's, the rights of a minority, that what he's echoing there is the argument that you were hearing at the time from the international ecumenical movement. So it's not a theological approach he has to this. It's more of a political one, really, and a church state one. So I'll stop there because I don't want to take too much time with this, but I'm happy to answer questions about it.
Yeah, and I should say, and I forgive me, I didn't tell you at the beginning. We will happily take your questions, and I'll ask them to Dr. Barnett. You'll see in the chat. Submit questions here. Maybe submit questions here can just maybe put another message in there for those who have come in. So we'll get to your questions. I just want to add a footnote. This is just between Vicky and me, but you're sharing in our conversation is that you know that Hans Ehrenberg was Franz Rosenzweig's cousin,
Yes.
right? So
Right. Well, and that's the background of his essay, which is fascinating because he's the one writer in 1933. He converted as an adult, so he really understood Judaism. He also understood Christianity. He understood them as a singular tradition, which makes him very complicated. But in his essay in April of 1933, in response to what's happening in the church, he actually explains, what's Judaism, what's Christianity, how are they connected? And he's virtually the only writer at that point who's doing that. And that's why I mentioned him, because it's such a contrast to the direction that Bonhoeffer takes. And I think, we tend to sort of oversimplify this and think, well, anybody who wrote about this was saying this. But when you look at these individual essays, they're, each one has a very different background.
Yeah, and I should mention to everyone here that Franz Rosenzweig is an incredibly influential German Jewish
Yeah.
philosopher, theologian of the early 20th century who died in 1929, but had also considered converting to Christianity, and that there was such a prevailing classical Christian culture that was so influential to so many German Jews that they found appealing through the work of what we would say Bildung, like acculturation, that the intellectualism was appealing to many Jews, and even some of the German saints like Goethe
Yeah.
appealed to Jews, so that when somebody is writing in that fashion like Ehrenberg, it's important to know that it was a proximity to Jews and Judaism that allowed them to have a much broader view.
Yeah.
And then the theology is a little unusual,
Yeah,
I
well,
guess.
he's complicated,
But
but yeah, the interesting thing is that I found a 1933 translation of Ehrenberg's document in the Federal Council of Churches archives in Philadelphia. So this got international publicity when he wrote it. People didn't necessarily know about Bonhoeffer's essay, because he wasn't he was nobody. But Ehrenberg eventually immigrated to Great Britain, and he was kind of welcomed as the father of the confessing church. So our take on Bonhoeffer today is very different from what people were looking at in the 1930s.
so there's one question that came. Please, you shouldn't direct message me. I so happen to see them, and I will ask this particular question, but send it to send questions here, and we'll address those questions. But um, would you mind, because we've been focusing a lot of our time talking about these men, consider talking about the life of women in Bonhoeffer's life, the people who seem to be invisible in this
Yeah.
movement, but actually played a fairly prominent role
Yeah.
in this type of resistance.
Yeah, and this is where I think we might get a different, again, sort of
Not
looking
just
at the
the
broader.
family, but like
Well, no, yeah,
the
I'm
activists, the
looking at the
theologians.
broader landscape. So the Bonhoeffer works, we finished up about 10 years ago. And after that, I left Bonhoeffer World, and I was especially interested in looking at these rescue networks in Germany, many of which come out of Sigmund Schultz's shop in the 1920s, because you had a lot of women who volunteered there, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, others. And after 1933, it's amazing to see how many of these women find their way into rescue networks. And so looking at those networks, and many of them in the confessing church, reminds us that people were very seldom rescued just by one person. And this is one of the fictions I think about Bonhoeffer. When I finished the Bonhoeffer works, I went back and looked to see exactly how many people approached him for help. There are 26 that are documented in the Bonhoeffer works. Only one of them is Jewish. The rest are all, Christians of Jewish descent. But all of these people are rescued. What Bonhoeffer often does is, write somebody for help, point them in a certain direction, because he's one of many. And when I began to look at these networks, all of a sudden Bonhoeffer pops up in places we didn't know about. Gertrude Luckner, who was a Catholic social worker, very prominent in the post-war era as a rescuer of Jews. She's been honored by Yad Vashem. There's a post-war interview with her at the Holocaust Museum where she says that Bonhoeffer came to see her during that period about rescuing somebody. In the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, I found an American rabbi who went over to Berlin in 1935 to help people. And he's in the Bonhoeffer family home, which is in itself risky during that period. And when he comes back to the United States, somebody writes to him and says, I'm going to Berlin, who should I reach out to? And Lazarin writes back to him and says, the younger Dr. Bonhoeffer. So there are places, in this larger network of people who are working together, where Bonhoeffer is one of the people who's willing to help. And that's not inconsiderable. There were people who did this and were executed or imprisoned. And if you look at the rescue events in which Bonhoeffer was involved, notably the Operation 7 rescue, which is a very complicated story, but basically, Bonhoeffer was part of the military counterintelligence at that point, and they sent money overseas into Switzerland to get visas for these people to get them out. So that's what Bonhoeffer knew about. The rescue itself was done by these networks of people. So that I found a document in the World Council of Churches archives. One of the people rescued was asked by Otto Freudenberg, who was the World Council of Churches rescue person, a refugee person. Right after 1945, Freudenberg wrote to him and said, who helped you? Who helped you get out of Germany? And Fritz Arnold writes back and gives him a list of 14 names, none of whom were Bonhoeffer. These were the people he knew had helped him. So to sort of look at the broader picture, Bonhoeffer's in there, but he's not the central guy. He's not the leader. And I think that rethinking Bonhoeffer and his writing, in that sense, gives us new insight, I think, into where he ended up.
And so with that, I want to move more into our contemporary political life. There was a biography written by Eric Metaxas about Bonhoeffer that's enjoying a lot of popularity.
Yeah.
And one of our participants wanted to know what explains this popularity, because it sounds a lot like contemporary hero worship that doesn't really underscore serious scholarship on his life and thought.
Well, it is. I mean, and this goes back to what we were talking about, that this is the image that is out there in 1945. And if you think about your own reading of history and where, what you know about that, where you haven't studied it in any depth, there are a couple names that pop up, and those are the names we know. And I think that this is true of Bonhoeffer. And when the topic of the churches and National Socialism comes up, Bonhoeffer is the name that people know. And so I think that explains why Christians from all points on the spectrum look to him. Metaxas's biography, sort of this heroic narrative. I'm critical of the political spin he puts on much of this, because I think that there are definite dog whistles in that book. But people reading this just for reading it, they're not going to necessarily spot those. And I think that explains the ongoing interest in him, especially now. I mean, if people are looking for Christian heroes, this is kind of what happens.
Well, and in relation to that too, because it seems like if you're looking for the heroes, we're also looking to be saved from something, and so there is a certain broad Christian theological impulse around that. But some of our participants are curious how the contemporary moment does in some way have similarities in terms with Bonhoeffer's time, not in that we're seeing a rise of Nazism, we're seeing a rise of nationalism worldwide, populism, strongman leadership,
Yeah,
rejection of multicultural and pluralistic efforts, and simple theology as a way to liberate and save the world from more,
yeah, yeah,
we'll say, nefarious multicultural and progressively oriented people. That
yeah,
there are some broad comparisons that be made, that if we're going to look into the past as a way to see where the mistakes might have been made, how can those mistakes help us in reconsidering and thinking how we react to our current political moment?
yeah. I think about this quite a bit. So the answer I used to give, and that I still give people, is two-part. One is that it's American history, not German history, that has brought us to this point. And so we need to look at our own history to confront our own demons. Yeah, and I think sometimes that reading Bonhoeffer and looking at Nazi Germany prevents us from doing that in an honest way. But in terms of Bonhoeffer himself and the history of Nazi Germany, I've always told folks, and this is what I talk about in my Bystanders book, is that the process by which people conform and become complicit and become part of evil on a mass scale tends to look pretty similar, whether you're looking in Nazi Germany, whether you're looking in other historical instances of people getting involved in evil deeds. That is, it's the grassroots, it's the step-by-step, day-by-day ways in which you cave and conform and become complicit, in which you don't speak out, in which you make a judgment call and you think, well, I've got my career to think about, I'm not going to get involved in this. Those concrete individual decisions, that's one of the factors that you really see in Nazi Germany. That's why these books like Klemper's or, Bonhoeffer's writings tell us something about the way in which, if you're just looking at the churches, tell us something about how church leaders decide to not speak out on certain things. They know where they understand what's going to get them in trouble, so they're not going to go there. Or in some cases, they really believe in certain things. They've got some doubts about others, but they're not going to speak out. And this is something I would say Bonhoeffer struggles with all the way through till the end. And that's what his essay After 10 Years is about. If you want to read sort of an analysis of, he's divided it into sections, who stands firm. And he talks about the way that the man of conscience fails, about the man with certain standards fails. This is the essay where there's that famous paragraph about stupidity. If people are familiar with Bonhoeffer's paragraph on stupidity, which I can send to you and you can put into the chat, where he's talking about the process by which people make themselves stupid. They decide there's certain things they're not going to know. They're not going to pay attention to certain things. They're just going to focus on their own lives. Those processes which are, understandable on one level when people are under that kind of pressure. We can never forget that Nazi Germany was a police state. But what that means is you lose your moral compass, you lose your moral self. And that's where I think Bonhoeffer is so good at and so honest. It's speaking to that issue, and that's where he ends up. Some of the most moving passages in his prison letters are, where he kind of says, a, a letter he writes to his namesake, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's Eberhard Bethge's son, who was, Bonhoeffer's godchild. And he writes him this moving letter in 1945 where he says, the world in which your parents grew up has disappeared. The church isn't going to be what it was. We have failed in every possible way. And then he says, and so the only thing for Christians in the future to do is to pray and do justice. That's where he ends up in terms of his faith, this brilliant theologian. And so that's, I think, instructive for how we think about ourselves today. If we want to keep our consciences, we have to find ways and spaces in which to do that. So, Bonhoeffer still has something to say, I think, on all this.
And I should mention too that in our follow-up email with all of you that have signed up for today, we'll include links with some of the literature that Dr. Barnett had mentioned. Maybe we can also include the stupidity quote,
Yeah.
and just some other resources for you to enrich your Bonhoeffer literacy. I have one final question. Given that you've spent a great deal of time and energy, both emotional, existential, and intellectual, on this area of study, I think we're curious if you're working on anything now. There are rumors about biographies and
I'm not,
Vicky
no,
Rumor.
the world does not need another Bonhoeffer biography. It's interesting because, like I said at the beginning, I'm not really a Bonhoeffer person. I have a much broader set of intersecting interests. And of course, I'm retired, so I actually do a lot of things that have nothing to do with any of this. But I've done enough research on Bonhoeffer, and I've got enough new things that I'm kind of putting that together in some form. It's not going to be a biography. But I think just looking at specific issues and the complexity of this person, as well as, sort of this larger landscape on which he moved. Most of the past 10 years I've spent looking at the international interfaith movement, which I think is fascinating. So Bonhoeffer is just sort of pops up in there. He's not a central character. But I think, looking at good people who are trying to do the right thing and often had the poignant sense that they had failed.
Yeah.
That seems to be my shtick,
No, it's obviously a shtick that we're all appreciative of, especially given that we can still learn from the people who fail, and that we don't always have to worship heroes at their consistent and perfect altars. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.